Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important and timely discussion on the future of Pakistan. My name is Nick Harris, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Security Unit here at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. I'm joined today by Dr. Kamran Bokhari, who's the Director of Analytical Development here at the New Lines Institute. Kamran is also a globally recognized expert on Pakistan. Kamran and I will be having a discussion with one of the most outstanding analysts on Pakistan, Mr. Najam Sethi. With Sethi Sahab, we will be reflecting on the recent series of events in Pakistan that led to the removal of Imran Khan from the premiership. We will also be analyzing the current state of Pakistan and where Khan's successor, Shahbaz Sharif, can realistically take the country. We will also forecast some potential future scenarios for Pakistan's state resilience and fragility. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Sethi Sahab. Najam
Uh,
Sethi Najam Sethi is Pakistan's most prominent journalist and analyst, and editor-in-chief of the widely read newspaper, The Friday Times. Mr. Sethi has served as the chief minister of the country's largest province of Punjab and chairman of the Pakistan Cricket Board. With over 3 decades of print and broadcast journalism experience, Mr. Sethi is well known for his incisive analyses and accurate forecasts of the politics as well as the geopolitics of his native country. Among his areas of expertise is a deep understanding of the Pakistani Army's role in politics and civil military relations. Thank you very much for engaging with us in this conversation. So,
Thank you.
I would like to start off discussion by asking you to reflect on what has transpired in Pakistan over the last several months, culminating in the removal of Imran Khan from the premiership to be replaced with Shahbaz Sharif. When Pakistani historians look back at this period, what are the key dynamics that they will focus on?
Thank you, Nick. I'll try to be brief so we can cover more ground. Um, the Pakistani military has always been interventionist from day one. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's indirect. It has a key role to play in Pakistan's politics and economy. And that has continued unsullied, in a sense, for many, many years. Um, the situation in recent times was that it was determined that they needed a new face. They'd had tensions with previous governments, led by two dynasties, the Sharifs and the Bhuttos. And they were looking for a third face. Um, and they realized that there was a new middle class in the offing, a lot of it in their own rank and file. And there was a lot of disillusionment with dynastic politics. And they could see that things were getting rough. So they decided they wanted a hero. They found one in Imran Khan. They cultivated him, they developed him, and then they launched him in 2011 12. Uh, Khan had been in politics since 1993-94, but had not got anywhere. In the meanwhile, um, there had been bouts of martial law and military rule, and then the two dynasties coming and going. Um, and then once they launched Imran Khan, they decided to put together a hybrid regime. He still didn't have enough votes to win an election, so they helped him win one. And then they brought him into power, and they have propped him up for 4 years. And they were quite keen on this hybrid relationship, whereby basically he was the front man, the man who inspired people, and they were running everything behind the scenes. They were recommending advisors, they were recommending ministers, they put together the government for him. They even put together parliament for him because he didn't have enough numbers even in parliament after they'd helped him rig the elections and brought him to power. And unfortunately, Imran Khan was not able to deliver the goods for them or for the people of this country. He was fixated on getting rid of the opposition, eliminating them for all times to come. He thought that the armies brought him in, now they'll keep propping him up, and it's as important to get rid of any other options they might have in reserve. So he focused not on government, governance, or other issues of bread and butter issues for people. Um, and instead, he focused on a campaign to eliminate the opposition. He had very little respect for parliament. He, not realizing that the allies that the army had put together for him needed to be mollycoddled, needed to be looked after, and that can only happen in parliament. He had no time for his allies. He thought, the army will look after them. I don't have to worry about that. Eventually, things began to fall apart, both with his allies, who felt that he wasn't giving them what attention they needed and the promises that were made to them in terms of their constituent requirements. And over and above that, he entered into a period of confrontation, tensions to begin with, and then confrontation with the army high command. And that had to do with his plans for the next 6 years. He wanted a particular general, General Faz, who was head of the ISI, to remain in place. General Faz had helped to bring him to power, had propped him up with direct and indirect interventions. And he wanted him to remain in the ISI. But by that time, there was a lot of discreditation taking place. Lack of delivery meant people began to first criticize him and then eventually turned their attention to the military. They said, "You brought him in. You need to take responsibility for what's going wrong here." And so, for the first time, the military came into the eye of the storm. The opposition decided at one stage that enough was enough, and it was time to attack the military. First obliquely, and then there came a time when the leader of the opposition, Nawaz Sharif, took names. He named General Bajwa and General Faz and said, "You are responsible for the mess in which this country is." To cut a long story short, if Imran Khan had given a modicum of governance or good governance, he wouldn't have been in trouble. They would have kept propping him up, and they would have then planned on giving him another term. Uh, but unfortunately, that didn't happen. When they decided to step back a little bit, their tensions began to uh, leave the same page dialogue that they had put together. And I think the opposition saw that as a great opportunity to edge in, and then thereby hands another tail. For the last 5 months, relations between Imran and the army high command began to deteriorate. And on the question of the ISI chief's appointment and shunting, they really fell apart. And there's a whole list of things that began to go wrong for both of them. Misunderstandings began to crop up, and so on. Until a stage came when the opposition thought that, now we have our chance. And the army then let it be known that they were becoming neutral or apolitical, meaning we're not going to help him anymore. You guys want to do something, you can do it. The opposition saw that as an opportunity, and I think they put together. It took them 4 months to put together a vote of no confidence. And at the end of the day, all it required was for about 10 of their allies, of Imran Khan's allies, 10 votes. Basically, the Karachi MQM, which has been a very prominent feature of Karachi, they parted ways, and then a couple of small allies from Balochistan um, uh, and that was it. And Imran lost his majority, and then he fought tooth and nail by unconstitutional means to hang on to power. And the army didn't bail him out. And that's where we are today. And we have a situation where he's out, they're in, the opposition is in. Their majority is very thin, maybe 3 or 4 votes. So they're hanging by a thread as well. If tomorrow the army decides that they need to change something again, they just have to do a wink and a nod to one of the new allies in the new government, and this government won't be able to survive. In the meanwhile, Imran is out there. He's got this conspiracy theory narrative which appeals to a lot of middle class urban Pakistanis about how America played a role in regime change, and their social media presence is so strong that they've been able to galvanize these forces. So he's out there as we speak. He is about to address a huge rally in Lahore, and he's thundering. He wants a quick election. He thinks his popularity, he's back in his popularity ratings are up. Now's the time to demand an election. And if he can have his way, he has a fair chance of giving them a run for his money. Earlier, and I'll close now so we can get on to other questions. 3 months ago, if you'd had an election, the opposition's parties were going to sweep the election. Today, it's going to be If you have an election today, Imran will have a good showing, especially in certain urban areas and among certain classes. But what happens 6 months from now? If this government can survive 6 months, maybe the gloss of Imran Khan's conspiracy theories, it will go off for the conspiracy theories, and then we'll have a new situation altogether. But currently, the army is under enormous pressure from his own rank and file and from the urban middle classes to have a quick election and give Imran another fighting chance at power.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Najam. That was a very detailed introduction for our listeners and viewers. Moving on, I'd like to ask you a question. This is like the fifth time that the military has intervened, four times directly with martial law, but trying to put together some form of dispensation that will work for them. This time around, they came up with this thing that you have explained in detail, the hybrid regime. It seems to me that this experiment has contaminated the body politic of the military, of the army, with lots of people at all levels of ranks in the army are have a soft corner for Imran Khan, while the top brass or what you've been calling the core group is basically far more realpolitik, that this person has tanked the economy and we just cannot allow this to continue, and therefore they withdrew their support. Can you explain to us what's really happening within the military as an institution in terms of this tug of war between pro Imran Khan voices and anti Imran Khan voices, or neutral as they're saying, or apolitical?
Yeah, you see, the whole ethos and training of the military has been that these politicians and these dynasties are landed, feudal or semi-feudal, and corrupt, and they haven't delivered. And the new recruitment patterns in the military now come from the urban areas and from the urban lower and middle classes. This is a new pattern of recruitment that has taken place. I mean, in the old days, the landed aristocracies and the business elites are also represented in the military. That's no longer the case. So this is a very post-Ziaul Haq, Islamized military, and coming from urban middle classes. And the whole training ethos has been anti-corruption and anti-dynasty politics. So it was only natural that they would, when somebody like Imran Khan came along, Mr. Clean, and with heroic proportions because of his cricket career and so on, there would be an affinity for them. So now what we have is, in the current situation, I would say that nearly 90% of all military families, retired and serving, which would make it a very big chunk of Pakistani society. There are at least 5 million retired army personnel in this country, and 90% of these families, retired and serving, have voted for Imran Khan and now are standing up for him. Number one. Number two, I think much the same, I would say, works now for the bureaucracy and for the judiciary. So the organs of the state were looking for a new leader that would be subservient to them, but would also resolve their problems with dynasties and feudal classes. And this new generation that has come up, I call them the children of Ziaul Haq. Conservative, anti-American. Don't forget, anti-Americanism started in this country in the 90s over the question of the nuclear program and the aid cutoffs and the Preston amendments and all the rest of it, and the whole controversies over the F-16s and so on and so forth. I lived through that time and I saw the anti-Americanism coming up in a country that was so predominantly pro-America until then. And even during the Musharraf's years, the whole drone issues and all the rest of it, this country was still continuing to be anti-American. So now they have tapped into this anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism, combined with this whole reaction against militant Islam outside Pakistan, which over here is billed as Islamophobia and all the rest of it. So these are the essential ingredients of this new middle class, and this is a growing class. So inflation doesn't bother them as much as honor and Islamic nationalism. And this is pervasive in this army now. and it's pervasive in the other middle class, the other urban middle classes in civil society as well. So, professionals, lawyers, doctors, army families, and including Air Force and Navy, the rest of it, there is a lot. All of them empathize with this notion. Islamic nationalism, they were all educated in the education system left behind by Ziaul Haq, which was not secular at all, which had, the textbooks were full of conspiracy theories and so on, and they were constantly being rewritten to accommodate the requirements of the establishment and so on. So we've had this is not a Pakistan I grew up in. This is a different Pakistan. Even the generals are very different from the generals I interacted with 10 years ago. And I find it very interesting that I could have a conversation with them at an intellectual level, but at an intellectual level, I find a lot of prejudice and pride and the rest of it in the current lot. And they're very sure of themselves. They have ruled this country directly and indirectly for so long that is now ingrained in the teaching that they have. So my sense is this is what is happening right now. The current core, they had a lot of support for Imran Khan because of this natural factor. And now, because as you said, he didn't deliver, and they were getting blamed for it, they started to flap a bit and say, okay, now what do? We got to distance ourselves from this guy. But having done that, now they find there's a backlash against the things that they've done. And they really don't know where to go because willy-nilly they've had to allow the old dynasties to come back. And there is a lot of resentment in their rank and file that what's going on. Okay, so the guy was not as good as you thought he was, but he should have been allowed to continue. We can't go back to the old ancien regime. This is the guy you needed to fix. And the whole problem of personal ambitions also came into play. Extensions for army chiefs, promotions, and so on and so forth, which got mixed up with the desire for an institutional change. And so, therefore, the target became one or two generals, both within the armed forces and outside. And Imran, of course, has taken full advantage of that.
Thank you very much, Najam, for that very interesting and comprehensive unpacking of this hybrid regime. I want to build on a point that you had raised about the sort of religious populism that Imran Khan represented. There have been many comparisons in the Pakistani press, in particular, of Imran Khan with former US President Donald Trump. Both men seem to have a good relationship. And it does seem over the last few weeks that Imran Khan is tapping into the sort of latent movement that may not have been completely visible, at least to outside observers in Pakistan. From a US perspective, with Pakistan being a major non NATO ally, the fact that the militablishment that the US had gotten used to engaging with may be changing as a result of the political and populist influence of Imran Khan. Where do you see these comparisons between Donald Trump and Imran Khan having merit? And where do you see differences in particular peculiarities in the context of Pakistan?
Well, this the point has been made again and again that Imran Khan is Pakistan's Donald Trump. I mean, the sort of support base that Donald Trump has, and how it's different from the traditional Republican base that other presidents and candidates have enjoyed in the past, and the sort of things he got up to, and the maverick nature of his policies. In fact, at one stage, even running counter to the American establishment's ambitions and so on and so forth, overseas and elsewhere. You have the same situation over here in many ways. Imran Khan trying to build on his Islamic credentials and trying to set up an alternative base for himself, Malaysia, Turkey, and Pakistan, and in a sense trying to tell the Saudis that you've been too close to the West, you're too much of you're lackeys of the West in ways that you shouldn't be. The Mahathir and the Erdogan and Imran, that sort of axis, which of course alienated him from his OIC allies led by Saudi Arabia, but it didn't matter to him. It was very popular at home. And of course, I think the army high brass got a little nervous because they said, hey, we're taking aid from Western institutions. We are trading with them. We are linked to them. And this guy is oblivious of all that. And he's alienating all our traditional allies and business partners and military suppliers. And this is not on. They got very nervous. They tried to tell him to take it easy. You have these views, but keep them under the belt. No need to go around, saying these things. Which is why, at one stage, General Bajwa, the army chief, actually went on in public and said that we need to move into geoeconomics rather than geostrategy. We need to normalize relations with India. We need to improve relations with the United States. And there was Imran Khan blasting away India and saying, nothing doing, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this. And, tilting at imaginary enemies like Don Quixote. No, we will never give the Americans bases, even though it wasn't clear what sort of bases or what sort of facilities they were looking for. And nothing had been settled. And he was already turning around and making an issue of it and so on. And so, therefore, I think he was going against the interests of the establishment, especially regarding strategic and foreign policy. I mean, his statement that, Afghanistan is freed from slavery. I mean, so here was the Pakistanis trying desperately to tell the Americans, we are not responsible for your failure in Afghanistan, despite all the allegations. And here there was the Prime Minister saying that, America had enslaved Afghanistan and so on. So you saw that those sort of tensions came into play. And I think it's going to be very difficult. People in India ask me constantly now these days, do you think this new regime will be able to make any offerings? Can there be any normalization with India? And I said, no. Imran is sitting out there. He's basically saying anyone who's friendly with America and anyone who's friendly with India is an enemy of Pakistan, is a traitor. So there is this narrative outside on the street, which is going to make it very difficult for Pakistan to normalize relations with either America or with India or in the region, in fact. And so I think we are in for a rough ride. Imran, in or out of power, is in a sense establishing a narrative which is going to be very difficult to shake off.
Thank you, Najam. And it's very interesting, this sort of journey of discovery or evolution in Imran Khan. I remember Imran Khan coming to Washington, D.C. in 2008 and spending a significant amount of time trying to engage with civil society, university students, government, etc., in a very different version of Imran Khan back then than what we see now. It's very interesting to observe over time his evolution as he's entered politics in full speed.
Yeah, you're right. But, my sense is he's a classic opportunist. The amount of U-turns he takes, I don't think he believes in anything except himself and his right to rule. I mean, he's quite capable of saying one thing today and doing exactly the opposite tomorrow, and not thinking that he's done something wrong. He is completely tuned into this whole notion of propaganda and being Mr. Teflon and nothing will stick to him. You can show 100 video clips where he said one thing and done the other thing, and it doesn't make any difference to his supporters. They're just oblivious to it. They're not ready to hold it against him because, first, they're sick and tired of the dynasties. I think you see the same problem in India. This dynasty problem creates this. And number one. And number two, the tag of corruption on the dynasties is a very deep one. This is not something new Imran has picked up. It's been there, and the army has been part of those who promoted this image. Every time they would kick out a government, they would accuse it of corruption, a civilian government. So obviously, generations and textbooks have grown up teaching this very thing, that these politicians are corrupt. Imran is not a politician, you see. Imran is a leader. He's a hero. He is not a politician. Everybody around him can be corrupt, but he is not corrupt, even though the evidence suggests to the contrary. But they are not ready to believe it. And then, of course, this whole notion of the social media. This has transformed Pakistan like it is transforming many other countries. Disinformation, fake information is now the norm. It isn't the exception. And the way Imran's party has mobilized social media to reach out to people and to disinform them or to misinform them, and how the more educated you are, the more likely you're going to have access to the internet and conspiracy theories and all the rest of it. And so more likely is that you will buy what Imran Khan is selling you. So that is where we are today. I mean, yesterday or day before, he had a Twitter space. There were 150 people, 150,000 people on his Twitter space. So I think I have not seen anything like this. And they hang on to his every word. It doesn't matter. He repeats himself. He says the same things. Those have been disproven time and again by facts, but makes no difference. So we have a very real situation in which a large section of the population is absolutely blind to his faults, and is determined to bring him back to power. And as I said, the dangerous problem over here is that retired and serving military and officers and their families, especially the young ones, are very pro-Imran and are not prepared to hear anything. And last point, as we all know, I mean, 50% of the population of Pakistan is under the age of 30, and a very significant portion of that is between the age of 18 and 30. And so you can imagine, I mean, I would have thought that 90% of urban youngsters are all pro-Imran or want to vote for him and want to support him and are not prepared to look at his rallies. 90% are young people. And so there you are. The demographics is helping him. The education system has helped him, and of course his own propaganda, or the organization of propaganda, has been tremendous, unparalleled.
This is an important point, Najam. And before I turn to Kamran, I'll just say that in recent discussions with some U.S. government analysts that focus on Pakistan and the Indian subcontinent, there's a sort of quip that he is in some ways the prophet Imran, and that he approaches his politics and his sociopolitics in that manner. And where you have an administration here in Washington that's very much focused on this idea of a global struggle of Democrats versus autocrats, and Pakistan being one of the largest democracies in the world, as rough and tumble as it can be. This is a very challenging time for the United States as it tries to approach Pakistan and to approach these very large and important democracies in the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan and India, and their interactions with each other, and this growing religious authoritarianism that has entered into the sociopolitics of both countries and seems to be going full speed ahead. Kamran?
Najam, I want to get back to civil-military relations, and I think we're at a unique moment. I was, if you will, I found the DGISPR, the spokesman of the military's press conference a few days back, I think it was last week, very extraordinary. Some very unprecedented remarks from General Babar that we've not heard come out, so publicly. But where do you see civil-military relations going? Because right now it seems that the military has a huge problem. It's no longer, overnight it seems to have changed, that it used to be Nawaz Sharif and his allies, being openly critical of the military. And now you have the same, Imran Khan, who was created by the military, basically biting the hand that fed him. And so if you're the military, you're being struck from both ends of the spectrum, or both, the political opposites, if you will. So game out for us. How do you see the military dealing with this? Because now they don't have good options or allies that they can sort of align themselves with to counter the more, if you will, toxic element in the Pakistani political landscape.
Yeah, I think they're in trouble. They are now having to deal with the new government, and frankly, if this new government doesn't deliver, and the delivery has to be with the people of this country, the bankrupt state of the economy has to be sorted out, and relief has to be given to the people, and there's no money for it. And the only place the money can come from is not China, is not Russia, is not Turkey, is not Malaysia. It is Saudi Arabia, and it's the United States, and it's the European Union. That's where the money is. That's where the loans are. That's where the exports are, and so on. And that's where the international institutions are. So now they have a real problem. They want this government to negotiate with Pakistan's erstwhile allies, the very allies that Imran Khan has alienated, and against whom there is a lot of anti-sentiment, against whom there is a lot of sentiment, anti-sentiment against them, in the very rank and bowels of the army and the bureaucracy and judiciary. And yet, their leaders want this government to negotiate with them and bring the goodies home and keep the economy afloat. And that's going to be the problem. And if this government fails, so this government has the envious task of being abused for going back to the donors and being friendly with them. Imran Khan breathing down their neck. And then the army that says, deliver, give something, make sure we get our defense budget, make sure you pay your loans and we don't default, and make sure that you're not overthrown by a long march from Imran Khan. We won't be able to help you if the guy decides to bring 100,000 people to Islamabad and besiege it. We are not going to open fire on anyone. We are not going to allow you have your police and your administration. You deal with it. So we are in trouble. The army is in trouble. They don't know where to go right now. They have a strong base that is opposed to the current regime. They would rather Imran Khan, with all his follies, comes back. At least it'll give them this feeling of we got our man back and so on. And we'll deal with the rest of it. We'll see what happens. They're not thinking about that. But the high command is thinking about it. So that's the first problem. And the second is that if this government falters, there's every likelihood that they will then, the opposition outside, Imran Khan, will demand a fresh election. And so you may see a situation where the generals will go and talk to the new government and say, you can't get your act together. The guy's breathing down our neck. Let's go for a fresh election. Let's get him off our back. You think you're strong? Okay, let's have a fresh election. Or if the government in power says, no, we are not ready for a fresh election. Right now, we are unpopular because of the sort of things you got us doing. And no, we don't want an election. And if they think, no, we have to get Imran off our back because he's creating problems for us within our own ranks, then what? Then they'll just pull the plug. They'll just one phone call to a couple of allies here and there, and the government falls. And Imran has already submitted his resignations to Parliament. And if the government falls, then what happens? As we stand, government is very difficult. And this government can't pass a single law in less than 30 days. And that's because every law has to go to the presidency, and the presidency is occupied by an Imran loyalist who says, I'm not going to pass any laws. They want this government to fall. They want a fresh election. And in this fresh election, it's anybody's guess right now. Imran thinks he's quite popular right now. My own sense is, even if there were to be an election today, he wouldn't win. Now, we can go into that. That's my assessment. I think Nawaz Sharif is still very popular in Punjab. Even if you think of urban middle classes voting for Imran Khan, I think there's a bigger chunk of people out there who still going to vote for Nawaz Sharif. Certainly the polls, until a month ago, the polls were showing that Nawaz is way up in terms of electoral prospects. And Punjab is half of Pakistan. So, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that if there were to be an election now, Imran would win. No. But I think the perception is being created. And Imran is successfully creating this perception that if there were to be an election now, which I want, he says, I will win. So they're going to stop me from happening. The opposition is hanging in there, hoping that they can survive this period for 6 months and 9 months. Their big fear is the following. And I think that's where the cookie will come to crumble. In November, the current army chief retires. If Imran is in power in November, Imran will want his own man as army chief. And we all know who that man is. That's where part of the problem arose. And in that case, the opposition that has actually decided to overthrow him right now rather than allow him to complete his term and become even more unpopular, they took this risk because they were afraid what would happen in November. If Imran is sitting there and he chooses his army chief, then the chances are that he will win the next election just as he won the 2018 election, and then he will go on to rule for another 5 years, and he will decimate the opposition during that time. So the opposition was very desperate. So they are going to try and hang in there till at least November, so they can appoint an army chief that is at least will give them a fighting chance in the future, if and when elections are held next year. So there is all this business about who will be the next army chief, who will be the DG ISI. and who will be appointing them, and how will they react to their appointments and their own ambitions and those of the opposition and Imran Khan. So the whole ball game is hinging on who the next army chief will be and who the next ISI chief will be.
Thank you very much, Najam. I actually want to build on this point with Shahbaz Sharif. It seems that he's put a lot of energy into sort of marketing this idea of Pakistan speed, that he is going to develop and bring momentum to get Pakistan out of some of this sort of economic turmoil that it finds itself in and that has all these social and political and potentially security effects. What is a realistic win, so to speak, for the new prime minister of Pakistan? And can he actually achieve Pakistan speed?
Well, I think he has immediate challenges, and then he has medium term challenges. The immediate challenge is to give some relief to the people of this country on inflation. That's one of the things that turned them against Imran Khan. If political polls show that nearly 60% of the people who are anti-Imran think that the reason why they're anti-Imran is because of inflation and the fact that their pockets have shrunk and that they're facing enormous difficulties. 40% of the population is now below the officially declared poverty line. And there's massive unemployment and there's resentment against Imran. Inflation. That has been the key issue, which is, of course, part of governance. And so, therefore, right now, before Imran was ousted, he froze. He entered into a program with the IMF, and because there was no choice, he entered into a program with the IMF, and then he realizes that IMF program is all about belt tightening and cutting down subsidies, and so the first subsidy IMF wanted cut was on energy prices. So he realized that he did that as a time bomb. That's a huge, like almost a 33 or 40% increase in energy prices in one jump. I mean, the government would have been just hit for a six. I mean, they would have been blown out. People would have been on the streets. So he decided that in his moment of difficulty, he said, let's freeze prices. And even if it means violating the IMF program, because I'm in trouble. So he froze those prices. Now that he's out, the new government has come in, is having to cough up 1 month's subsidy of nearly 100 billion rupees. That's the cost of freezing those prices. And now the challenge is that can you keep them frozen for a few months while you stabilize? While you form a government, you form cabinets, so that Imran, who's thundering outside, is not able to create another problem. Once the energy prices go up, Imran is going to go to the streets and launch another long march on Islamabad. And the people are going to be so angry at this new government that, you promised to save us from these policies. Now you're doing exactly the same thing. You're a slave to the IMF. We don't care. So Imran's narrative will be strengthened. So now here's their problem. They don't have the money. And so what that means is they will have to completely freeze development expenditures and everything else in order to cough up another 400 billion rupees, which is a huge chunk. The total development budget is about 800, 900 billion. This is like half of that in 3 months or 4 months. And where are they going to get the money from unless they cut it from other sources? And there's not much space for cutting. And then, of course, the IMF is going to say, no, what is going on? So our finance minister, who was appointed only 3 days ago, has rushed off to Washington for a bailout. He has to persuade the IMF to allow his government to breathe. If the IMF relaxes their terms and says, okay, we understand, we think you have a better chance of managing the economy, at least we trust you more, and so on, he has a snowball's chance of surviving. But the thing is that if the IMF continues to be tough, this government won't survive 3 months. Then he has to go to Saudi Arabia and again beg money. So if the Saudis give you a bailout, if the Americans institutions give you a bailout, they can put their feet firmly on the ground and make sure that Imran doesn't come back thundering in. And so I think this is the make or break for them. The budget is due in 3 months. That's also going to be a tough budget. But I think right now they need to stabilize. They need to hold things before they get out of hand. And their biggest challenge is this. So it's anybody's guess whether the new finance minister will succeed in Washington or not, whether there will be a softening of their attitude and say, okay, we've been disappointed in the past by previous governments who've never really kept to an IMF program, and so we understand this. Okay, we will relax this and we will relax that, and we'll let you move along a little slowly. If the IMF relents and the IMF relaxes some of its conditions, this government has a chance of survival, and then face the other challenges that come in due course. But if the IMF sticks to its guns, as it were, and we are then facing bankruptcy, we have a current account deficit that we can't manage, and inflation that we can't manage, depreciation of the rupee we can't manage, reserves falling we can't manage. We have only 2 months of reserves available for our imports, and so on. So this government is now inherited the landmines that Imran has laid before leaving, and unless there is some international help, I'm afraid this government won't be able to survive. The important thing is that this government should survive. Then there should be then they'll have a better chance at winning the next elections. And I think we are going to go through this very difficult period in the next 6 months. I'm very apprehensive. I think if they survive the next 3-4 months, they can probably survive longer. But if they don't survive the next 3-4 months, if they are compelled to carry out anti-popular, anti-people measures in the economy, then I'm afraid Imran Khan will have a lot of ammunition with which to blow them away.
Thank you very much, Najam. And it seems the more that the current government has to turn to Washington and to international creditors, the more it feeds into Imran Khan's charges that it's an imported government. It really does seem to be like the current government is stuck between a rock and a hard place.
That's right.
Kamran?
Yeah, Najam, I want to go pick on that point about assistance from the international community. I mean, if you look at the geopolitical landscape, the United States has its hands full with Russia right now, and by all accounts, we're not just looking at how to get to a ceasefire in Ukraine. The United States and its allies are going into a long-term strategy, executing on it to isolate Russia because there's no going back to Putin. At a time like that, U.S. bandwidth is stretched. Russia crisis, Ukraine crisis, came at a time when the United States was already trying to meet the challenge from China. So, and we have, Imran Khan's, incessant charges that the United States ousted him from power. He's saying this day in and day out, and he's not relenting. How do you see in this context? And then you have Afghanistan, which is a huge problem for Pakistan and the region, and can become is a big concern for the United States as well. How do you see the United States being able to help Pakistan? Obviously, there's something can be done through the international lending institutions, but to me, it seems like it requires much more. Love to get your thoughts on that.
It does require much more, but I don't think this is the time to think of what much more is and what's the time period for that. I think what needs to be done right now is to get the international institutions to stabilize Pakistan's economy without any upheavals. And I think the restoration of Pakistan-American relations may be postponed until such time that there is a stable government in place and there is some relief for the people. And any overt attempt for both sides to sort of bend the rules and try and help each other may be a little counterproductive. And as you say yourself, the Americans are focused on so many other things. And in any case, there's no reason why America should be bailing out Pakistan. And, right now, there's not much that America wants from Pakistan. So, in terms of structural reasons, I think we can put that on a back burner. But I think for the sake of form, good US-Pakistan relations, even for the sake of form, without any concrete, direct bilateral assistance, is a good starting point. But more important, the international financial institutions need to relax their demands for the time being. We need to get over this particular hump where the military is in a straitjacket and Imran is pushing, and his narrative is a very anti-American and actually, in my view, it's very anti-Pakistan. The consequences of his narrative are isolation and failure, but he's not concerned with that. That's what populists are all about, especially the modern day populists. Uh, so I think I have no illusions about that. But I think the Americans have allies in the Middle East and so on. So I'm sure a package can be put together on its own merits, not to impose further hardships and to give Pakistan another fighting chance, or at least the next government a fighting chance to get on with it and to survive and stabilize. Because the alternative to all this is chaos. I mean, and that chaos is not a positive. It's not a ingredient for positive change. It's an ingredient for pulling the country back into some dark abyss, and where whatever little international relations have remained, it will be complete isolation if that happens. And I'm afraid when things get to that point, even this united, disciplined army, um, I dare not think of uh, internal tensions boiling over and confusion. So therefore, I think we need this year is very critical. I think this government, with the best of intentions, Shabazz is a good administrator. He needs uh, uh, he needs a slightly freer hand to deal with this economic situation. The politics of it is not important. His partners will stick with him. The army high command will stick with him, provided he's able to get the economy moving and give something to the poor and to the people, so that people think, okay, we at least now have a semblance of good government. These guys, whatever they may be, but at least they're getting things moving. And I think so that's where we are right now. And but the alternative, frankly, to me, is extremely distressing.
Thank you, Najam, and I appreciate you unpacking for us the potential way forward with the current Pakistani government. I'm sorry to do this, but I want to go down this path that you've mentioned and we've sort of hinted at in the potential sort of difficult moments ahead, the dark path. It seems that in some ways, Imran Khan, going back to the analogy that those U.S. government analysts of Pakistan had told me, the Prophet Imran does seem to have this sort of esoteric or almost religious perspective in a very folksy populist way, in a sort of the tradition of the peer, so to speak. And you can see that in the way he seems to have evolved, in his rhetoric, and even in the interactions that he had with Vladimir Putin right after the Russian war in Ukraine began, this sort of sense of a broader esoteric vision for the country that not everyone is sure where it leads. So I wanted to ask you, in your analysis of the man, and in some ways the myth and legend Imran Khan, where is he heading? What is he trying to do with this movement that seems to be gaining speed around him? And in a worst case scenario, what does it look like, and how should the world be prepared for that?
Imran wants the Pakistan army to be his army. He wants the generals to be at his beck and call. He is a classic fascist, and the people who support him, frankly, have no idea what fascism is or what authoritarianism is. Many of the same people have supported military governments in the past. Anti, shall we say, democracy in that sense. Some of them pretend to be liberals, and some of them pretend to be very religious, and some of them are conservative. So it cuts across all the classes in that sense. The common theme, anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism, Islamic nationalism, and an aversion to the dynasties and the families that have thrown up. 30 years these dynasties have ruled. And the army and the textbooks and the media have all portrayed them as corrupt. So one comes, the other goes, one comes, the other goes. And when one is eased out, often with military assistance, eased out, the next one comes in and then again is eased out. I mean, we say that no prime minister has completed his term. And invariably he got into trouble with the military high command, and therefore conditions were created, whether via the judiciary or whether via any other reason, to throw them out. So now we've ended a place where there's only Imran Khan, and then there's the guys that you've been that have been coming in and out, and now you have you thought you had a new hybrid experiment, and from day one, somebody who didn't come off, into power on his own steam, that you brought into power. Earlier, the guys who would come into power or into office, as I say, not power but office. Power belongs to the military. Would at least win the right votes. They would come in with their votes, so they always had some sort of a mandate. This time, that wasn't the case. But Imran, of course, thinks that that was his right. And his attitude has always been, you brought me in, you keep me up, and I'm going to not do this and I'm going to do that. And so I think I wouldn't call it, although, by the way, he keeps talking about, the state of Medina in the 8th century, in the 7th century, and so on, and the in notions of equality and religious blah, blah, blah. He talks about all that. That is part of the narrative that he's built up. But I think at the end of the day, he is not seen as a prophet. He's also often referred, illusions have, crept in from time to time. He said things that, oh my God, he's almost saying that he's a chosen one. But at the end of the day, this is still a civil society in many ways, and the challenge to him on the religious front is coming from some religious parties who are now making inroads into the electorate. A lot of voters are now voting for certain religious parties who are very militant. And in fact, Imran has, in a sense, taken part of their narrative away from them in order to pull back some of their votes. And so that's the sort of situation we are faced with. I don't think it's that prophetic. He doesn't have those dimensions. He's fallible. But I think in order to combat him, you need to have the same sort of, shall we say, social media presence. We've just heard how Imran Khan's team had 1,000 accounts, which translated into 5,000. So within half an hour, they could generate trends in this country with fake news and with condemnations and so on and so forth, using robotics. 100 people generating an impression in this country that there are millions who are supporting Imran Khan and so on. And the opposition doesn't have anything like that. They think they can combat him with the truth. My sense is this. The truth is not going to combat Imran Khan. The falsehoods that he's propagated are so deep. And as we know, people tend to reinforce prejudices. They tend to stick together, and the more they stick together in WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups and other social media groups, the more they reinforce their prejudices. And they will act irrationally. But it won't occur to them that they're acting irrationally. So that's the modern phenomenon of social media that is transforming brains. I call them brainwashed because they're not ready to listen to logic or to reason or to facts or to the truth. And the current government thinks that we will show them the true face of Imran Khan. It's not going to work. We have a more complex problem in this country right now. There are 60 million internet users in this country. And almost every person who's slightly literate can use a phone is one of the highest densities of mobile phone use and internet use and so on. So we have a serious issue in terms of the information that's getting through to people and turning them. Donald Trump did use the same sort of tactics in America. And fake news, disinformation, keep hammering away at it. Keep lying. You will lie 10 times, people tend to believe it. And especially if there are people who think that you're Mr. Teflon, nothing sticks to you, and you're and the younger generation, I call them the children of Zia, and they're in their 20s and 30s and early 40s. They know very little of Pakistan history. They are what I call half-educated. But it doesn't matter, even the most educated amongst them, for various different reasons. Some because they're liberals who think that dynasties shouldn't exist, and so therefore this is an urban man. We empathize with him, we see him. So there are lots of complicating factors here. But right now, it's a very tricky situation out there. This lot that is supporting him is not insignificant. They're passionate. They're rigid. They're abusive. The amount of violence that has now come into Pakistani politics because of this lot. The old traditional notions of democracy and um, um, uh, relationships, despite antagonisms and hostilities, the forms that used to take. All that is gone. Imran has brutalized politics. His people, every day, I mean, there are everyday incidents where Imran supporters will bully people on the streets, in restaurants, call them out for being traitors, for being American agents, and so Indian agents and traitors. And then you have brawls. This has never happened in this country, the polarization that is now taking place. And the brutality, the aggression, the violence that is in the air. Uh, we used to think that only religious parties can do that. They're not a patch on what is happening in this country right now. Perfectly reasonable people, otherwise, are prone to be intolerant of anything that criticizes anyone who criticizes Imran, and they will launch social media campaigns. And when you are on the road, they're quite capable of attacking you on the road. Things are rough out here.
Thank you, Najam. That is a very disquieting description of the trend line in Pakistani politics. And when you consider the religious nationalism that has been let develop and is bloom in neighboring India, and then you have two of the world's largest democracies,
That's right.
and both are nuclear weapons powers. And so much of the future of the global order will be decided in South Asia. We hopefully won't be heading towards a dark path, and hopefully reason will take hold, but that is not guaranteed. Kamran, I want to give you the opportunity for the last question.
Yeah, you basically hinted at it, Nick. So, I mean, put all of this in the regional context for us, Najam. You have hostile relations, increasingly hostile relations with India, or at least they're not going to be repaired anytime soon. At least I don't see it. But if you see some hope, please let us know. But then there's the western flank, the western border. Um, Afghanistan is already a post-American Afghanistan is heavily Talibanized. We see ISIS attacks growing there. We have TTP attacks taking place in Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban rebels. So, from a pure security point of view, with political economic chaos in the country, uh, what does protecting Pakistan from being, from that spillover from Afghanistan? I mean, from a pure American point of view, um, the hope that the United States had is, well, if there is a relatively stable or secure Pakistan, then it could help contain, a Talibanized Afghanistan. So put us, paint a picture of this region for us, and I guess that would probably be the last question.
Kamran, I'd see no prospect of any initiatives vis-a-vis India. Imran will make sure that anybody who tries to normalize relations with India will be put on the mat. Even when he was in government, that was his position. Even he could spurn General Bajwa's attempts to normalize. Even a couple of items of trade, he put his foot down. So I think there's no prospect of any short-term India-Pakistan rapprochement on anything, frankly. And considering the fact that there's very little quid pro quo, the whole sum zero game, the Indians, Prime Minister Modi is, of course, in no mood to give away anything. So any conditions that Pakistan attaches to a normalization are not going to be acceptable to them. And they have their own agenda, and they've done reasonably well without having to worry. And they are now sponsoring all sorts of problems for Pakistan. So now that's number one. So I don't see that's happening. I don't see any deterioration in relations. I don't see any new tensions with India. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the ceasefire that the generals negotiated with the other side is going to stick. So I'm not worried about that flank. My worry is on the other flank, the western flank, because as you say, we have issues with Baloch separatists, and we have issues with TTP and IS, and of late now, because these attacks are taking a heavy toll of our border security forces, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5 every day attacks, and leading to martyrs on the Pakistani side, especially the security forces. And now we are being accused of intervention in Afghanistan, physical intervention in Afghanistan, to eliminate pockets of posts that are sponsoring trouble in
You're
Pakistan.
referring to the airstrikes.
I'm referring to what we hear are airstrikes that have led to some strain in relations with Afghanistan. We deny it, of course. I have no knowledge that those airstrikes originated from Pakistan, but that's the allegation out there. And relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan are not good right now. And I think I certainly expect that the Taliban will, in the next 3 months or so, will try and avenge some of this. So, which means that the border is going to remain problematic with Afghanistan. And the old bonhomie that we want to get Afghanistan recognition and blah 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 and give them money and all. I think things are on hold right now because the Afghan government has not helped Pakistan put down these terrorists who are creating difficulties for us. There's a frustration at this side that we're sitting ducks and we're not doing anything. But here's the irony: when the Americans use that argument uh, to intervene to protect their security interests. The argument here was, why are you intervening in another country? When the Indians sent rockets flying over there to try and take out some jihadi camps over here, the argument was they're crossing the border to do things that they shouldn't do. And now the allegation is on us that we are doing things across the border to protect our interests, active interventions that we shouldn't be doing. So there are all these complications coming in. And I suspect that the western border is going to remain hot. I don't think it's going to spill over to such an extent that it creates instability in this country. I think the armed forces are quite capable of defending that border and to keeping it limited. And they're throwing a lot of manpower and money into making sure that that border doesn't become so hot that you can't deal with it. So I think in terms of the security environment, there's not going to be any further deterioration. But I think the important thing is if the economy breaks down, and then you have to deal with all these issues, and on top of that, you have to deal with domestic politics, which may take a violent turn and create chaos, which could lead to another economic crisis. Because, of course, the stock market, foreign investment, loans, all the rest of it is affected when economic activity goes down. And so, that is my big fear. I'm not worried about the security, the classic physical security dimension right now. But if the economy falters, then of course, all these dimensions get affected.
Thank you. Nick?
Thank you, Najam, so much. And wanted to give you the opportunity, if there's anything that we haven't covered in the discussion that you'd like to present to all those that are watching now, for them to take away with them as we enter this, as you put it, very critical stage in Pakistan's history.
I think the army chief has got it right. He wants to restore normalcy in Pakistan's international relations with its traditional friends. I think he should be helped in that task. My sense is that the current government is keen to do that. My sense is they're on the right lines. But the man sitting outside is thundering away, and given half a chance, if he comes back to power, we will be in trouble. That's my assessment. Of course, his supporters think quite the contrary, which is fine. But I think he's singularly incapable of delivering anything except isolating us and creating difficulties because of his personality. And so I think this is a moment for the international community to think seriously about whether they're going to leave Pakistan to fend for itself. Because fending for itself will eventually mean you'll have to fend for it one way or the other, whether negatively or positively, because of things that you and I both know about. And so therefore, I think it's time for wise heads to prevail and for long-term interests to predominate the scene rather than old distrusts and animosities or tensions and so on. General Bajwa's speech reflects serious thinking within the armed forces core group, which is of course important because the rest is not so important. They are the ones who have to deliver the pensions and the budgets and the weapons to their rank and file. And if they're unable to do that, there will be resentment. If the perks and privileges are cut down because defense budgets are being cut at this moment where you have a situation. Long term, you can negotiate all this, but right now, that will fuel those who are against this, the new dispensation that has come into play. And then the people like General Bajwa and everybody else will be swept away.
Thank you very much, Najam, for these excellent, timely, and actionable recommendations, and for your brilliant analysis on Pakistan, the neighborhood Pakistan lives in, and the broader geopolitics of the Indian subcontinent. It's been a pleasure having this discussion with you. And to all of those who are watching us, thank you. We will continue at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy to focus on the Indian subcontinent, which will shape the course of human history in this century. Thank you, everyone.